They chained him for their amusement. They threw him into the arena to die for their pleasure. But he refused to kneel. From the blood-soaked sands of the gladiator pits rose a man who would shake the foundations of Rome itself. His name was Spartacus, slave, warrior, rebel. Against impossible odds, he built an army from the broken and the damned, crushed Rome's legions, and for a moment, made the greatest empire in the world tremble. This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of defiance, of freedom, of the fire that even crucifixions could not extinguish. This is the story of Spartacus. The roar of the crowd was deafening. In the heart of Capua's great amphitheater, sunlight poured down on sand soaked with blood. Romans filled the seats, senators, merchants, commoners. Every class united by one cruel delight, watching men kill or die for their entertainment. It was a spectacle Rome prided itself on, a ritual that kept the people fed with excitement and distracted from their own troubles. To the Romans, the gladiator games were tradition. To the gladiators themselves, it was a living nightmare. Among the men forced into the arena was Spartacus. He had not been born to chains. He was a Thracian, once a free man, a soldier in his homeland near the Balkans. Some accounts say he had fought as an auxiliary in Rome's armies before deserting. Others suggest he was captured during Rome's endless campaigns and dragged away as a slave. What is certain is that he found himself stripped of his freedom, sold to a lanista, the owner of a gladiator school, and forced into the harsh life of a fighter. The gladiator schools were prisons disguised as training camps. Inside, men from across the empire were caged together, prisoners of war, criminals, or simply those unlucky enough to be enslaved. They were branded, beaten, and drilled like animals. Their bodies were weapons, and their survival depended on obedience. Food and medical care were provided, not out of kindness, but to keep them alive long enough to die in the arena. Spartacus endured the training at the ludus of Lentulus Batietus, a man whose fortune came from bloodshed. The regimen was brutal sword drills until arms went numb, mock battles fought under the whips of instructors, and nights spent in iron chains. Escape was punished with death. Hope was crushed before it could form. Yet Spartacus carried within him a quiet defiance. He fought well, but unlike some gladiators who sought glory, he refused to see the arena as his destiny. The games themselves were a cruel theater. Spartacus had stood in the sand, the crowd screaming as he faced another enslaved man. He remembered the sting of sweat in his eyes, the weight of a borrowed sword in his hand, and the knowledge that one of them would not leave alive. For the spectators, it was entertainment. For Spartacus, it was humiliation. To fight for survival under the eyes of those who cheered his suffering was worse than death itself. But even in that world of chains and blood, bonds were forged. Gladiators learned to trust one another, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. They shared food, patched each other's wounds, and whispered in the darkness about dreams of freedom. Among them were men who had once been kings, soldiers, farmers, fathers, now reduced to property. Each carried a story of loss. Each carried the ember of resentment. Spartacus's reputation grew inside the school. He was strong, disciplined, and intelligent. He had a way of speaking that made men listen. When he looked at his fellow gladiators, he did not see broken slaves. He saw soldiers, men who could fight for more than Roman amusement. Slowly, a dangerous thought began to spread among them. What if the chains could be broken? The world outside the walls of the ludus offered no mercy. Rome was at its height, a city of marble and power, ruling over lands stretched from Spain to Asia Minor. Slaves were the backbone of this empire. They worked the fields, built the roads, and filled the arenas. To revolt against Rome was unthinkable, like striking at the gods themselves. Yet history often begins with the impossible. For Spartacus, the arena was no end. It was a reminder of what had been taken from him. Every time he raised his weapon in the sand, he carried not only his own rage, but the silent fury of thousands who had been chained. And with each fight, the idea of freedom grew sharper, like a blade hidden in the dark. The amphitheater cheered for blood, but in the heart of one gladiator, rebellion was already taking shape. The moment came in the summer of 73 BCE. Within the grim walls of the gladiator school in Capua, whispers turned into plans. Spartacus and around 70 of his fellow gladiators could no longer bear the humiliation. Freedom or death, Anything was better than another day in chains. Their plan was desperate. Armed with kitchen knives, skewers, and whatever crude weapons they could seize, they staged their breakout. It was chaos, a handful of slaves against heavily armed guards. Yet desperation makes men fierce. They fought like cornered wolves, cutting through their captors, seizing wagons of weapons meant for the arena. By the end, the impossible had happened. Spartacus and his band of gladiators were free. They fled into the countryside, hunted and outnumbered. Rome expected them to scatter and die, as most runaway slaves did. But Spartacus was no ordinary man. He led his group into the rugged slopes of Mount Vesuvius, using the terrain as both shield and fortress. From there, raids began. They struck farms, caravans, and outposts, gathering supplies and freeing more slaves along the way. What started as a handful of fugitives swelled into hundreds, then thousands. Word spread quickly. Across Italy, slaves whispered Spartacus's name like a promise. Men and women who had been bent under Roman whips saw in him a chance for revenge, or at least a chance to die fighting rather than kneeling. They came barefoot, hungry, armed with farm tools or stolen swords, but their spirit was unbreakable. Spartacus became their leader not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. He shared their hardships, ate their meager food, and fought alongside them in every skirmish. He was not a king, but a comrade. His vision was simple yet revolutionary: to break free of Rome, march north, and escape beyond the Alps to their homelands. In those early months, the Roman Senate dismissed the revolt as a nuisance. They sent small detachments of soldiers, confident that a rabble of slaves would be no match for Rome's legions. They were wrong. Spartacus and his men, hardened by survival and fueled by rage, crushed each force set against them. The slaves were no longer prey, they were predators. For the first time in living memory, Rome trembled not from foreign armies, but from those it had enslaved. The rebellion burned across Italy like a wildfire. By the winter of 73 BCE, Spartacus commanded an army of more than 70,000 men and women. They camped in the mountains, lived off the land, and struck wherever Rome was weakest. Slave hunters and militias fell before them. Even trained Roman troops met humiliating defeats. One of Spartacus's most brilliant moments came on Mount Vesuvius. Trapped by a Roman force under Praetor Claudius Glaber, the rebels seemed doomed. Glaber cut off every path, confident he could starve them into surrender. But Spartacus refused to bow. In the dead of night, his men fashioned ropes from vines and climbed down the sheer cliffs at the mountain's rear, a route the Romans had thought impossible. They circled behind Glaber's camp and launched a surprise attack at dawn. The Romans panicked, their formation shattered, and the slaves annihilated them. This victory electrified the rebellion. No longer a desperate band, they had become a true army. They marched across southern Italy, defeating one Roman legion after another. Towns were raided, storehouses emptied, prisoners freed. To slaves across the peninsula, Spartacus was a liberator. To Rome, he was becoming a nightmare. Yet even in triumph, Spartacus kept a clear vision. He urged his followers to march north, to cross the Alps and return to their homes. Freedom lay not in fighting Rome forever, but in escaping its grasp. Many agreed, but others were intoxicated by victory. Some wanted to plunder Rome itself to punish their masters. Others, especially Gauls and Germans in his ranks, craved conquest rather than escape. The seeds of division were sown. Still in those years, Spartacus was unstoppable. He crushed praetors, consuls, and armies thought invincible. Each victory echoed across the empire. Rome's senators whispered in fear. The question was no longer if Spartacus was a threat. It was how long Rome could survive him. By 72 BCE, the rebellion stood at its peak. Spartacus commanded as many as 100,000 men. They moved like a tide, sweeping northward, defeating two consular armies in pitched battles. For a moment, freedom was within reach. But divisions tore at the heart of the movement. Spartacus urged the march north, toward the Alps. He knew the rebellion could not last forever. Rome's power was vast, and vengeance would be merciless. Escape was the only true victory. Yet many in his army resisted. They had tasted Roman blood and victory. Why flee when Rome could be destroyed? The disagreements grew into fractures. One faction, led by the Gaul Crassus, split from Spartacus with tens of thousands of men. They sought their own path, plundering and fighting as they pleased. Rome seized the chance. Crassus and his followers were crushed by Roman legions, slaughtered to the last. When Spartacus learned of it, he mourned, not only for his comrade, but for the rebellion itself. Unity had been their greatest weapon, and it was slipping away. Desertions became common. Some fled with loot, some lost faith, others simply longed for home. Spartacus, once surrounded by men who believed in freedom, now found himself commanding an army divided by greed, fear, and ambition. And yet, Rome was regrouping. No longer would senators send inexperienced praetors or overconfident consuls. They turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a ruthless commander hungry for glory. Unlike his predecessors, Crassus did not underestimate Spartacus. He raised legions, drilled them with iron discipline, and prepared to crush the rebellion once and for all. The tide was turning. Crassus struck with calculated fury. He drove Spartacus's forces south, cutting off escape routes, building massive fortifications to pen them in. Trapped in the toe of Italy, the rebels faced hunger, exhaustion, and despair. Yet Spartacus refused surrender. In one of his most audacious moves, he tried to cross into Sicily. Pirates had promised ships to ferry his army across the strait, where they could rally more slaves and build a new base. But betrayal struck. The pirates took payment and vanished. Spartacus's dream of renewing the fight collapsed, leaving his army stranded. As Crassus tightened his grip, some of Spartacus's followers lost faith. Thousands deserted. The once mighty army was shrinking. Yet Spartacus still fought like a lion. He led daring breakouts, smashing through Roman lines, buying time again and again. His followers looked at him not just as a leader, but as a man who carried their last hope. In the spring of 71 BCE, the final confrontation approached. Crassus's forces outnumbered the rebels, disciplined and determined. The Senate, fearing Spartacus might yet escape, recalled Pompey from Spain and Lucullus from Thrace, two celebrated generals. To ensure Rome's victory, the noose was closing. On the plains of Lucania, Spartacus gathered his men. He knew the end had come. Some sources say he killed his horse before the battle, declaring that if he won, he would have many horses, and if he lost, he would not need one. His army was weary, battered, but their spirits burned with defiance. They would not die as slaves, but as free men. The final battle was ferocious. Spartacus hurled his men at Crassus's legions with every ounce of fury left in them. Waves of rebels crashed against Roman shields, swords clashing, cries echoing across the field. Spartacus himself fought at the front, cutting down soldiers with a desperate strength. Accounts say he fought his way toward Crassus, determined to strike at the Roman commander himself. He killed 2 centurions, his body pierced with wounds, yet he fought on. Surrounded, bleeding, he refused to fall back. His end came not in surrender, but in a storm of steel, fighting until his body could no longer stand. With their leader dead, the rebellion collapsed. The battlefield was a slaughter. Tens of thousands of rebels lay dead, their blood soaking the Italian soil. 6,000 survivors were captured alive. Crassus, to make an example, ordered them crucified along the Appian Way, the road from Capua to Rome. Mile after mile, crosses lined the road, each bearing a dying rebel. It was a message to all who might dream of freedom. This is the price of defiance. Rome had crushed the greatest slave revolt in its history. The Senate celebrated, Crassus claimed his triumph, and Pompey boasted of finishing what Crassus began. The power of the Republic was restored. But though Spartacus's body was lost among the fallen, his name refused to die. Rome thought it had ended the story. To them, Spartacus was just another rebel leader, defeated and forgotten. Yet history remembered him differently. He had begun as a slave, stripped of everything, forced to fight for amusement. Yet he dared to defy the greatest power of his time. He built an army from the broken and the beaten, humbled Rome's legions, and for a fleeting moment, carved out the possibility of freedom. His rebellion failed, but his courage endured. In the centuries that followed, Spartacus became more than a man. To slaves, peasants, and the oppressed, he became a symbol of resistance. To revolutionaries, he was proof that even the most powerful empire could be challenged. From ancient historians to modern writers, his story echoed across time. Rome lined its roads with crosses to erase his legacy. Instead, those crosses became monuments to his defiance. Spartacus showed the world that freedom is worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible. And so, though the sands of the arena once drank his sweat, and the fields of Lucania drank his blood. Spartacus lives on, not as a gladiator, not as a rebel, but as a symbol eternal, the man who rose from chains to challenge an empire. They tried to erase him with the sword. They tried to silence him with crucifixion. But Spartacus did not die on that battlefield. His body may have fallen, yet his spirit marched on. Rome won the war, but it could never kill the idea he carried that no man is born a slave, that freedom is worth more than life itself. From the blood on the Appian Way to the pages of history, his name endures as a beacon for all who dare to rise against oppression. Empires fall. Chains rust. But Spartacus remains, a warrior eternal, a voice that still whispers across centuries, freedom is worth the fight.